In this presentation, we will look at producer surplus. Producer surplus can be thought of much as the same way that we thought of consumer surplus. It's the difference between the lowest price that a firm would accept for a good or service and the price that it actually receives. What is the lowest price a firm would be willing to accept for a good or service? That's going to be the marginal cost of producing a good or service. Remember, the marginal cost is the additional cost to a firm of producing one more unit of good or service. Let's return to our tea example from the last presentation. Heavenly Tea is a very small producer of tea. Let's look at a situation where the market price of tea is $2. So now for that first cup of tea, it costs Heavenly Tea $1.25. For the second cup of tea, it costs them $1.50. For the third cup of tea, $1.75. And finally, the fourth cup of tea would cost them $2.25. So if the market price of tea is at $2, Heavenly Tea would be willing to sell 3 cups of tea. They receive a producer surplus of 75 cents on that first cup, the difference between $2 and $1.25. That's represented by the area A on that rectangle on the figure on the right. For the second cup of tea, the producer surplus is going to be 50 cents, the difference between the price of $2 and the marginal cost of $1.50, and that's represented by the rectangle B. Finally, the third cup of tea, they're selling for $2, and the marginal cost, what they're willing to sell the tea for at the lowest price, is $1.75. So there's a 25-cent difference, a 25-cent producer surplus for that cup of tea. Now, a typical market with many sellers is going to have a straight demand curve like we've worked with supply and demand curves in the past. The total amount of producer surplus from tea sellers that they receive from selling this tea can be calculated by adding up the entire market and the producer surplus received on each cup sold. So the total producer surplus is equal to the area above the supply curve and below the market price of $2. You can see that as the shaded red area in the figure on the right. So now, what exactly do consumer and producer surplus measure? Consumer surplus does not measure the total benefit that consumers receive. It measures the net benefit that they receive from participating in a market. So consumer surplus in a market is equal to the total benefit received by consumers, which you're going to measure in dollars to keep things simple, minus the total amount that they must pay for the good or service. So this is the total benefit that they get minus the cost to them. Similarly, producer surplus measures the net benefit received by producers for participating in the market. The producer surplus in a market is equal to the total amount that firms receive from consumers minus the cost of producing that good or service. So it's the total amount of money they receive in revenue minus the cost of producing that good or service. In the past, we've talked about how when a market is in equilibrium, it is at its most efficient. So we can think about efficiency in a market in 2 ways. The first way, a market is efficient if all trades take place where the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost and no other trades take place. The second way to think about the efficiency of competitive markets is a market is efficient if it maximizes the sum of consumer and producer surplus, so the total net benefit to consumers and the total net benefit to firms. This is known as economic surplus, the combination of producer surplus and consumer surplus. So remember that the demand curve describes the marginal benefit of each additional cup of tea for consumers, while the supply curve shows the marginal cost of each additional cup of tea for producers. If the quantity is too low, then the value to consumers of the next unit exceeds the cost to producers. So let's say in this market for tea, that the quantity demanded in equilibrium is 15,000 cups. But the quantity being produced and being consumed right now is at 14,000 cups. Do we think this is going to persist? Well, the marginal cost of producing the next unit, the next cup of tea, is $1.80. But the marginal benefit for consumers of that next cup of tea is $2.20. So, consumers will be willing to pay money for the cup of tea in excess of what it costs the producer to make the tea. So producers will continue to supply more and more tea into the market until we get up to 15,000 cups. the output is inefficiently low at 14,000 when the equilibrium quantity is at 15,000. So the invisible hand, the chance of profit, will encourage firms to produce more and more until we reach equilibrium. Likewise, if the quantity being produced is too high, then the cost of producers of the last unit is greater than the value that consumers are driving for. So consumers are not going to purchase it at that price. So in this example, using the tea market again, let's say the equilibrium is still at 15,000 cups, but there are 16,000 cups of tea being produced. The marginal cost of that last cup being produced at 16,000th cup is $2.20. Meanwhile, the marginal benefit to consumers of that last cup of tea is only $1.80. So consumers are not going to purchase that last cup of tea because it costs more. They'll have to pay more than the benefit that they're receiving. Only at a competitive equilibrium is the last unit being produced valued the same by producers and consumers, causing economic efficiency. So where the supply and the demand curve crosses each other, that 15,000 units at the price of $2, the marginal benefit for consumers is $2. The marginal cost for producers is $2. Right there it's equal, and there is the competitive equilibrium where the economy is most efficient. But there's an alternative way of looking at it. Let's use the ideas of consumer and producer surplus. The figure on the right shows the economic surplus, so the consumer surplus and the producer surplus in the market for Kai tea. At the competitive equilibrium quantity, the economic surplus is maximized. So our two concepts of economic efficiency are resulting in the same level of output. Since our two ideas of economic efficiency coincide and they end up giving us the same result, we are now able to better define economic efficiency. So economic efficiency is a market outcome in which the marginal benefit to consumers of the last unit of a good produced is equal to its marginal cost of production, and in which the sum of producer surplus and consumer surplus is at a maximum. So the economy is at its best point, is at its most efficient when it is in equilibrium. But let's explore what happens to consumer and producer surplus when the market is not in equilibrium. In this case, there's what's known as a deadweight loss. So in the competitive equilibrium in this market, there are 15,000 cups being supplied and demanded per day. That's the quantity on the market. And the price is going to be $2 per cup. The consumer surplus is going to be represented, if we look at the figure on the right, by areas B, C, and A. Those three areas combine for the consumer surplus because they are above the price and below the demand curve. Now, the producer surplus is going to be above the supply curve and below the price. So that's going to be areas D and E. Now, let's say that the price for a cup of tea is $2.20 instead of the equilibrium price of $2. So what's going to happen? Well, the consumer surplus is going to decline. Instead of being areas A, B, and C, it's only going to be the area A, between the new price and the demand curve. Now, the producer surplus is going to be the areas of D and B. It's going to be above the supply and below the price. Now, areas C and E are going to be deadweight loss. They are no longer part of the consumer or producer surplus because there's only 14,000 cups of tea being sold. Because those units are going unsold, the potential benefit to producers and consumers in the economy are being lost forever. And that's why we call it deadweight loss. Now, in this scenario, the producer is being made, it looks like they're being made better off, that the area of B is greater than the area of C and E. Sometimes the deadweight loss is larger, sometimes the deadweight loss is smaller. The reduction in the economic surplus resulting from markets not being in a competitive equilibrium is known as a deadweight loss. The deadweight loss can be thought of as the amount of inefficiency in a market. So in competitive equilibrium, the deadweight loss is zero. When the market is out of equilibrium, the deadweight loss is going to grow.